G'day Jafffa Adventures, Terry King here. Welcome to the channel. Now most people when they start their vehicle up in the morning, they turn on the radio, pop it into drive or into first, and off they go. 9 times out of 10 when I start my vehicle up in the morning, I roll down the windows and I drive down the road for 60 seconds or so, and I use my ears, and what I'm listening for is anything out of the ordinary. We just got back from a big trip on Tasmania recently, and one day when I did exactly that, used my ears, this is what I heard. What I'm going to share with you today is how to replace the uni joints in your cruiser on both the front and the rear tail shaft, or drive shaft, depending on what language you're speaking. Oh, and by the way, another term for a uni joint that you might often hear is a spider joint. And if you buy the part from Toyota, genuine, that's actually what the factory call them, spider joints. Not exactly sure why. They've only got 4 legs. Before I jump into diagnosing how you determine whether yours are failed or not, or are failing, let's identify what they are first. If you've got a 200 series, you got 4 of these suckers. This little guy here is the uni joint, which joins the propeller shaft to the output flange on your diff. That's at the rear. If we run along the tail shaft, you come up to the next one. That one there joins the output flange of your transfer case to the tail shaft. We then jump up to the front tail shaft. That universal joint there joins the rear of the front tail shaft to the input shaft on your transfer case. And the last one, which is much more difficult to see, is right in there, and that one joins the output flange on your front tail shaft to the front of the front tail shaft. So how can you diagnose whether your uni joints are bad or on their way out? Well, one way is to grab your tail shaft and give the joint a twist or push it up and pull it down to try to get some movement out of it. Now you have to be careful with this diagnosis method because obviously if you're twisting it back and forth, you hear that little bit of a clunk, you might think, oh, my uni joints are no good. That's actually not true. That's just the backlash in the diff. So I'm lifting this uni joint up and down, and I'm pushing it side to side, and I'm twisting it, and that one is in pretty good nick. It's not making any noises, or I'm not feeling any movement in that joint whatsoever. But if I was, that'd be one way to diagnose it. The second way to diagnose these things is using your ear when you're driving the vehicle. If the uni joint has failed completely, you'll get a loud clunking noise or even a grinding noise coming from that joint as it flexes through its range of motion. That noise can be tricky though because it's not unique to uni joints. If you had other component failures in your car as well, diff pinion seal for example, it might make that same clunking noise. You might get some vibration through your drivetrain because your tail shaft is allowed to flop a little bit because that joint is worn out. However, that same symptom again could be a worn pinion bearing in your diff. And that's why it's so important to come under the vehicle here and actually grab your tail shaft and give that uni joint a little bit of a twist and a flick to find out whether you've got any movement in that. So what about these uni joints? I got very little movement or play in these uni joints whatsoever. But as you heard in my opening clip, if you were paying attention, there is a very distinctive and a very unique sound that a failing uni joint makes. And I can't think of another component on your car that makes that sound when it's going. And that's that little ping or a tink that you could hear in that opening clip. That is unique to a uni joint and no other component on the car will make that sound. It's not very loud, and if I had my windows rolled up and my radio blaring as I drove out the driveway, I would have never heard that. So my uni joints haven't failed yet, but they are on the way out because they're making that little tink noise. So what I'm going to do is replace all 4 uni joints in the cruiser, and for those of you that care, that's what this video is all about, replacing the uni joints in your 200 series Landcruiser. Now this procedure that I'm going to show you is on my 200 series Landcruiser, but this procedure is exactly the same on your 100 series, on your 80 series, on your 60 series, on your 45s. The only thing different will be your part numbers. Now for the 200 series, the genuine part number is 04371-670, and that little sucker is the same for all 4 uni joints. So you just need to buy yourself 4 of those. Are they cheap? Shit no, not from the factory. $102.68 each if you want to go genuine. And what's actually in this little kit? Well, let's have a look. You got your 4 dust caps. Be real careful with those because inside of those are needle bearings. You got 4 new clips to hold the spider joint in place. And then you've got the actual spider joint itself. And that's what that little thing looks like. It's got a Zerk fitting on it. So let's jump underneath the car and get this shit show on the road. Now, although this tail shaft might look pretty crusty, and these uni joints might look pretty crusty, this is a finely balanced and precision bit of kit. The reason that's important is when you start to take this apart, you want to make sure that you clock it in the exact same way that you did when you took it off. So this round thing here is the pinion flange of your diff, and this little thing here is the part of the tail shaft. What I'm going to do to make sure I put this and this right back in the exact same position is I'm just going to get a center punch, put a center pop there, and put a second one there, and line those 2 dots up. If you've got an older vehicle, it might pay to just go around and have a look at the other 3 because somebody could have had this off already and has already marked it, which might be a bonus for you. You don't have to mark it. Or if you go ahead and mark it and somebody else has put another mark on it, when you go to put it back together, you might be going, oh shit, which one's my mark? Now we're going to repeat that exact same procedure up at the front of the tail shaft. All right, I'll loosen these nuts now. They're a 14 mil. Once again, have a look and make sure that you're taking notice of the orientation. The nut goes on the back, the head of the bolt goes on the front. Why do you think that is? I'm not certain, but I suspect it's because that's your direction of travel. If that nut was facing forward, the thread on the end of that could get pretty damaged. Sitting back here, it's nice and protected. Now you won't get a socket on that, there's just not enough clearance, so you gotta use your spanner. But typically your spanner is too short and you can't get enough leverage to crack that nut. A trick that I've learned is you just take another ring spanner, pop it on the end of that spanner, and now you've got one twice the length and double your leverage. If your car's on the ground, great, you can just start swinging. If it's in the air like mine, you either got to get somebody to stand on the brake or put a lever in place and lever against the lever. There we go. We'll just go around and I'll crack all 4 of those nuts. There's always one that's stubborn, so I had to put the socket on the end of the bolt so it wasn't turning. And that's it. That's all 4 of them. They're a special nut and bolt too because they got really, really fine threads. I'll show you. Have a look at that. That's how fine they are. Now this is the next level of being anal, but I'm going to put the bolts back in the same spot where they came out of. And to do that, I'm just going to mark them. Do you need to do that? Absolutely not. In fact, I think this is the first time that I've ever put the bolts back in the same hole. Another thing to note, these only have 1 washer, and the washer goes on the bolt head side, not on the nut head side. Okay, I've got all 4 of those bolts undone, and that one is just in by a couple of threads. That's it, that tail shaft is now off of that pinion flange. Now let's move up to the front. Now on the front of the rear tail shaft, you have 4 studs and 4 nuts. So what we're targeting to take off is just the nut and the washer. I'm not going to mark these nuts on their individual stud. I'll just randomly pull them off and randomly put them back on. Now to get to that front tail shaft spider joint, you got to take off this funky bracket that goes around the transfer case, and it blocks your access to that uni joint. So that's got to come off. It's not hard, it's just tricky. So let's get stuck into that next. There are bolts everywhere holding this bash plate on. You got a couple up here. You got to remove that earth strap. There's one behind this counterweight, so you got to pull that counterweight off. There's one here. There's a couple up the front. Here's what we've got so far. Here's another one. You got to take this funky bash plate off as well to get to another one of these bolts that's behind here. All right, that bash plate. This comes off now. Have a look at this thing. What the hell? I'd like to have a talk with that engineer who designed this thing and say, what's going on, dude? Were you smoking crack when you designed this? Same as the rear, we just give this pinion a little bit of a whack. That's it, she's broken free. Now because we've got this splined expansion joint or sliding joint, we can just wiggle this, compress that joint a little bit, and the tail shaft is now off. Come back to the back, take that final nut off. That's That's it. Tail shaft is free. There's our tail shaft. Now let's just take a little bit of an in-depth look at this, because as I said before, clocking is important. So the tail shaft is oriented with this part of the yoke kind of C-shaped that way. On the other end, it's C-shaped in the opposite way, but they are parallel with one another. Some tail shafts are perpendicular to one another. So that's one important alignment. Now because this thing's so bloody long and unwieldy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate this slip joint here, but when I separate that slip joint, again we have to keep this orientation perfect. So I'm going to put a mark here and make sure that I line that back up the correct way. There we have it, my orientation line. That'll then allow me to separate this slip joint. And there might be a little bit of suction on it. There we have it. Now we got a much smaller piece to work with on one end anyway. That's better, a little bit more permanent. Okay, I'm going to show you two different methods of getting these uni joints out. One's the old-fashioned hammer method, and one's using a press. Back to the orientation I was talking about before. The position of this zerk is important as well, because if you get that wrong, it may be in a position where the tail shaft is actually closed up and you can't get your grease gun in there. So I'm just going to put a little lettering in here that says zerk, and that'll tell me that the zerk is pointing out this direction out of the tail shaft, which means when it comes time to orient the new one, that's the exact position that I want, just like that. Okay, the first thing we want to do is knock these little clips out, and you can use anything really, screwdriver, punch, whatever you can get to fit in there to dislodge these little suckers. You can see how that clip's being dislodged now after I've knocked it a little bit. Then you can get a screwdriver behind it and pop him out. That's what she looks like when she's out. And as you saw in our new kit, we don't need to reuse these, so we can throw them in the bin, but I like to keep them just off to the side for a second in case when I'm putting those new ones in, one goes flying across the shed and I can't find it. All right, let's knock out the remaining three. Number 2. Number 3. There's our final one, number 4. Okay, method number 1 is the whale on it method. I got the tail shaft locked into place with a couple of bench vices. I got myself a 20 mil socket. I'm just going to pop it on there. I'm going to start whaling on it. Well, after a lot of whaling, I finally got it. And what did I have to do? I had to get a little bit of WD-40 to lubricate it. I had to step up the size of my hammer. And I've got an old drift. I don't know what actually got that from originally. But anyway, that just allowed me to grab onto it when I'm whaling on it. If you are going to use a socket like I started with, you want to put vice grip around there so that you don't smash your fingers. But that's it. That dust cap is through. And you can see over here on the other side, that one's popped out on the back side. Then you can go around on the other side, grab a pair of vice grips, and just work that dust cap out. There we have it. Dust cap is off. That can go in the bin because you obviously got replacement ones of that as well. So what's next? You can see that that side's pushed all the way down. We now need to drive it back this way. So we're going to come back around to this side and knock that sucker back down. It's going down a little bit easier than it came out the other way because obviously it's been freed up now. Right now it's proud of the yoke. I'll keep knocking that until it's flush with the yoke, and then I'll get a pin punch. Okay, that's about flush. Now we'll get ourselves a punch and continue to knock it and drive it all the way through. That's it, it's through. Spin him around. We can pull that part of the uni joint off now, get it out of the road. We can get our vice grips and we can pull that cap out. And that's it. That's how to disassemble this using the knockometer method. Before I pull the uni joint off of that side, remember I talked about our zerk and the importance of that alignment of that zerk? So that's how that fit in there originally. Now this one can either go this way or this way, and that is exactly how it needs to be aligned. So what I've done is marked on the bottom of this spider joint 2 diff, so that I know that that aligns in that direction. Now I'll show you how to use the press method, and this is my preferred method because it's a little bit more controlled than whaling on the thing. I got a socket which is a larger diameter than that cap size, so that when the cap presses out it goes inside of that socket, and of course that pin size on the press is smaller diameter than that cap as well. So let's line our Whole shoot and match up. Looks pretty good. Let's put some tonnage on this thing. That is slowly coming out, but it's starting to get a little bit pissed, so I'm going to back it off. But you can see that cap's now pressed below that surface, and that cap there is now proud of that surface. So I'll just readjust him and keep on pressing. Okay, that's now pushed through. We'll release the pressure off our press. Get our unit out of there. There's our bottom bearing cap. Didn't even need the vice grips. That's popped off. And now the same as before, we drive that back down in the other direction to get that cap out. I'm actually going to use the hammer method on that because it is a lot easier with a hammer than trying to line things up on the press here. I'm over on the bench vise now. I got my hammer, I got my punch. Let's finish this one off. There it goes. Take our dust cap off and slide our spider joint out. And that's it. That's now disassembled. And I've taken a little bit of brake cleaner and cleaned up both parts here. When you are wailing on this or pressing on it, if you've inadvertently hit that surface at all, when we go to put the next dust cap in, it's going to catch on anything that might be uneven there. So what I've got here is a very fine flapper wheel. It's about 120 grit, and I'm just going to go around and clean that edge up. Whatever you do, don't get inside of this bore and take any material out of that bore, because that is interference fit with those dust caps. If you take material out of there, then you're going to have a sloppy U-joint, which is the whole reason that you're doing this in the first place. That looks pretty good. Now I'll do the exact same thing on the tail shaft end. Hit it with a little bit of parts cleaner again, just to make sure there's no abrasives that are sitting inside of that bore. There we go, nice and clean. There's my Zerk marking here. There's my Zerk marking here. So I know that that aligns that way. However you choose to mark it, just make sure that before you take this thing off, you've got some sort of an alignment marked on this. What you could do is you could get it around 180 degrees backwards, and that could throw the whole tail shaft out of balance. Now I want to work reasonably clean here. I'll pull out my dust caps. There are two for that end of the uni joint, and I don't know whether GoPro's going to pick it, but you can see that there's roller bearings inside of there, and those roller bearings are only held in there with that grease. So if one falls in on itself, you won't get the cap to seat in this spider gear. So it's very important that all of those roller bearings are lined up properly. Okay, I got myself a fresh rag. Just gonna wipe down this spider gear, make sure that there is no contamination on it. Looks good, I'm happy with that. We've already cleaned that up. I'm gonna take just a tiny little bit of anti-seize, just a little dollop like that, and pop that in these mating surfaces just to help it run down a little easier. Now the same thing with these dust caps. I'll wipe down the outside of them. Marvelous. Okay, we'll start a dust cap in this bottom one. We'll get our spider joint, Zerk marking, pop them in there, and then seat it into our cap, just like so. Turn that over, and we'll drive that down a bit. I'm holding that spider gear in place while I do it, and I've got myself a brass hammer. Doesn't take a lot of whaling to push them in. Looking good. She's gone down about 2/3 of the way, maybe 3/4 of the way. Now that I've got that started, and I'm happy that that's square, I'm going to grab my other dust cap, take them in from the other end, make sure that that spider joint is sitting in there. Very good. I'm going to get myself a socket, set it there, pop that side on the socket, and start to knock this side down. Make sure the uni joint's nice and free. Double check my Zerks pointing in the right direction. Sweet. Tick, tick. Now the distance you want to drive these in is dictated by where that circlip is going to engage. So if I grab one of my new circlips and I try to put it in like that, it won't fit on either end, so I know both ends of that cap need to drive down a little bit further. So the clip fits in that one. Yep. Clip fits in that one. Excellent. And you can see on either ends, it's just below the flush. Give that a bit of a wiggle. Make sure that that's not bound. If that is a little bit bound, it feels a little bit crunchy or a little bit tight, give that a little whack, and all of a sudden you can feel that free up quite nicely. Okay, let's pop these little circlips on. You can hear it change note when it's seated. That one looks good. Listen for the note change. Hear that? Beautiful. 1/2 of a spider joint installed. Okay, now time for the tail shaft end. A little bit of anti-seize in these yokes again. Okay, there's our marking for the Zerk. There's our marking for the Zerk. So that sucker goes in that way. Cool. That's cap number 1. Give it a little tap. Seat it in there. That's good. Cap number 2. Okay, we'll put our socket underneath there. Joint's still good. We got her. No little bearings laid over on us. Let's send her home. That's far enough for that clip. Let's knock our clips in. Clip number 1. I had to turn the video off there for a second. The rain was hammering down that hard I couldn't hear anything. Anyway, that joint's now done. Feels beautiful. Zerk marking to Zerk marking. Zerk sit in the right spot. The spider joint says 2 dip on the back side. Now I'm going to grease this uni joint before I put it on the car, because I can get it open and get to it really easily. Alright, I got my grease gun. Pop it on the Zerk fitting. I'm going to pump it until I see grease just coming out of each one of those caps. There's grease being forced out, and you can see just a little bit of grease pushing out of each one of those bearing caps. That's how you know it's time to stop. Okay, that end is finished. Set this aside. Now it's time to work on this end with the slip joint on it. The procedure is exactly the same as it was on the other end. Before I kick off, I will mark it out again and make sure that orientation stays exactly the same, just like the other one. I'll proceed to pull this apart. If I get stuck on something, or there's something hairy, or I get a curveball, I'll be sure to film that, because if you get a curveball, it might help you in trying to work it out. Okay, I got one end in. This side, I've been knocking in, and I can't get it to go any further than that. So I can't get my clip in either side, and it won't go below that surface on either end. So what's happened is one of those roller bearings inside of there have fallen down, and it's sitting on the bottom of one of these caps. So got to take this side apart, have a look inside of there, see if I can find that fallen roller bearing. And there you have it, exactly as I suspected. The roller bearings have dropped down onto the top of that cap. I certainly don't do things by halves. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these little needle bearings laying down in the cap. So I'll dig them out with my little pick here, pop them back in place, and we'll give this another go. There we go. I've got everybody where they need to be, and we can double check that by sliding that cap over. Okay, let's give that another go. Okay, there's where our Zerk goes. So this is oriented in that manner. Cap number 1. All right, after taking it off again and digging those bearings out, I got it where it needs to be. It's all locked in with its C-clips, and we're just greasing the joints now. There we go, grease coming out of every one of them. Okay, now we can put this tail shaft back together. I'll clean off this little slip joint. We'll grab our other piece. We'll line our 2 marks up. Okay, that's good. That's where she goes. Now you can see how much trouble I've got forcing that together. That's because there's air inside of here, and there's a really, really nice tight seal, so it's not wanting to slide together. So what that means is I got to take this Zerk fitting out to allow me to compress this joint. And whatever you do, don't grease this sucker up before you put it in the car, or you won't be able to collapse it enough to get that end over top of those studs on the output flange of the transfer case. And this is a classic example of why you don't over grease this sucker. You only put maybe 7, 10 pumps of grease in there when you're lubricating this tail shaft, because if you put more in, you get this hydraulic effect. As luck would have it, I'm missing my 7mm spanner. And of course, what size is this Zerk? 7mm. I can't get a socket down over it because the head of the Zerk sits too proud. And I really don't like to use vice grips in this circumstance, but I don't have a whole lot of choice. It's got him. Just double check my alignment, which is perfect. Sweet. Now I'll take my tape off. Put a little bit of anti-seize on here. There we go. That's about where it was running, was about there. So I won't take it down any further. Clean off Mr. Zerk and screw him back in. Now torque it down with my vice grips. There we go. All right, that tail shaft is ready to go back into the car. There's my pin punch mark right there on the output flange. There's my pin punch mark on this end. And remember, I've numbered my bolts. So that one there is number 1. And remember, the washer went on the bolt side, not the nut side. Slide that in there, and we will start that nut. Being such a fine thread, it takes forever to do the nuts up. Okay, those are all in place. I won't torque those down yet. We'll move up to the transfer case end next. All right, I got my pin punch marks lined up, and we just got to get this started. Okay, I got those 4 nuts started. Now I'll just run them down with whatever implement I can get in there. Maybe my 3/8 drive ratchet might get in there with a wobble. The one. For the observant ones out there in the crowd, you will notice that I forgot to put the washers on. So I get to undo all 4 of those nuts again and put my washers on. I'd like to think bonehead moves like that happen to everybody. All right, I got those 8 bolts in both flanges all done. There, I've given that slip yoke about 10 pumps. Now I've obviously got to torque both of these flanges. I'm not going to do that, however, until the car is down on the ground. Just too hard to hold the tail shaft from turning and torque it at the same time. But I know how shitty my memory is. So, to help me out, putting a little bit of tape around the tail shaft here. I'm going to write myself a message. Not torqued. So now if I forget it, it's my own damn fault. Now you might be thinking, what a moron. During the course of this job, he can't remember whether he's torqued these bolts down or not. In my defense, this procedure's probably taking me about 5 days now, on and off. That's one luxury that I've got. I don't use this car as my daily driver, so I can do the job at my own pace and edit my videos along the way. Okay, let's move on to the front tail shaft and pull that little sucker off. All right. I am now at the rear of the front tail shaft. Let's see what configuration bolts we've got on this one. All right, it looks like we've got a nut and a washer on a stud. All right, we'll come back when I get all 4 of these off. Okay, those bolts are off. Let's just see if I can crack this drive flange. There we go. We'll just leave that rest on the studs. Now the front of this tail shaft is in a real bear of a location. It's behind this cross member. I think I can only get to 1 bolt at a time, and I think I got to take this transmission bash plate off to get to it. I can get to that nut there, and that's the only one. So I'll have to crack that one and then twist the shaft and move along to the next one. Before I get too far, I'm going to center punch this so that I know how to put it back together again. All right, that's been center popped. Now, luckily, I can get my impact, half-inch impact in here. Okay, let's knock this drive flange off. There she goes. Looks like it has to be clocked just the right way to clear this cross member. The problem I've got is I can't compress that slip yoke, so I've got to pull that Zerk fitting out of there to allow the grease and the air to come out. Allow me to compress that fitting so I can get this tail shaft out. All right, I got my front tail shaft out, ready to pull these uni joints apart. I'm not going to film this. You've already seen that done before. However, if I do run into any curveballs, I will take a shot of that to possibly help anybody else out that might run into the same problem. The front tail shaft is back in situ. The swap out on the front went seamlessly. There were no hiccups or no problems at all. Follow the exact procedure you saw that I did on the rear, on your fronts, and you'll be sweet. A couple of things we got to do to finish up. I've got to torque all of these bolts down. For all the bolts, they are 65 foot-pounds. Now, I'm not sure what that is in Newton meters, but 65 foot-pounds is what you're after. You can get to the bolts with a 3/8 drive, and I've got one of these little wobble joints on the end of the extension that just allows that socket to flex a little bit. And that's enough to change the angle on that socket to allow you to get in on top of those nuts. So I'll finish torquing everything down here. I'll put my guards back on the transfer case, and then it's time to take this thing out for a drive and see whether we've got a ping. All right, let me finish this up. That's it, the little tinking noise is gone. That makes me one happy camper.